welcome to the Rockefeller Institute. My name is Tom Gaze. I'm director of the Institute. And I'm very happy that you all made it through the snow and the sleet, etc. And not so much sleet today, but snow. And come to this wonderful forum. There are two Nobel Prizes for dealing with social or collective problems. One for peace, and one for economics. One addresses the ending or preventing war. One deals with depression and poverty. But I always thought we needed a new category, maybe a Nobel Prize for solving seemingly intractable problems you notice when you're not getting shot at or worrying about your next meal. And one of those prizes should go to whoever figures out how to get local property tax policies right. Local governments, as many of you know, face a kind of tyranny of arithmetic as they try to reconcile revenues, expenditures, residents' capacity to pay, and local needs, all the while when they don't really have much control over many of the variables that factor in these equations, such as state and federal aid, healthcare costs, education needs, and natural disasters. Governor Cuomo's property tax cap measure is thus a kind of grand experiment constraining what happens within this complicated system. And it's all played out in a state of nearly 4,000 local taxing jurisdictions. And I hope this is just the first of a series of forums on how these caps actually work out in practice over the next several years. Well, we have a great set of speakers to get this series started, but they will be introduced by our moderator. I'll introduce your moderator myself. Bob Ward is Deputy Director of the Institute and Director of our Fiscal Studies. His recent work includes studies of state gambling, governors' roles and powers in the budget process, state fiscal sustainability, economic conditions in New York State, including the manufacturing sector, and states' capacities to forecast revenues. He's author of New York State Government, which we've issued twice, and he has advised New York governors and other state officials on fiscal and economic matters, including analyses for previous governors' Commission on Property Tax Relief. He's advised federal officials, including his testimony recently on state and fiscal trends and the federal role for the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives in 2010. But before I turn things over to Bob, I want to make a couple of advertisements. For those who can't get enough information about property taxes, I should note that Jim Follain's paper will go up on our web tomorrow. We're delighted with it. Jim draws on an extraordinary set of data, and we hope that continues as well. Also, fairly soon, we're going to release the first of a series of at least we hope, a series of quarterly reports on the national picture with respect to property taxes. Lucy Dadayan will be the primary author of those reports, and I expect those to come out probably sometime this month. And finally, for those who want to change in topics, I should note that our next conference is next week, Tuesday, March 6th at 8 a.m., or actually people will start speaking at 9 a.m., on higher education and international relations, and that'll be chaired by has been organized actually by Jason Lane, our Director of Education Studies. In the meantime, please, everybody, power down anything that's going to go beep, any cell phones, pagers, whatever. And when we do get around to question and answers, please identify yourself and speak into the mic. Thank you very much. Bob.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for being here with us today. I'd like to start this discussion by invoking the immortal Danny Donahue and saying thanks to the property tax funded public employees who have cleared our streets so we could all get here today. And of course, thanks to the property taxpayers who make that work possible. We are here to talk about the property tax cap that the legislature enacted last year at the urging of Governor Cuomo. Many people here know that serious discussion of a cap had been underway in Albany since Governor Spitzer appointed a commission to study the issue in 2007, although a lot of us were convinced that it would never happen in New York, given the strong resistance from many of the most influential players at the Capitol. But not only does New York now have a tax cap, we have one that's among the most stringent in the nation. And looking at the history of state and local government finance in this state, I think it's fair to say that creation of the tax gap was the most consequential decision by the legislature since the enactment of creation of Medicaid in the 1960s. So we'll hear a lot about the implications of and implementation of the tax gap over these next couple of hours. If Tom referred to the difficulty that people have had with the property tax from so many different perspectives over a long period of time. So if misery loves company, it may be some small comfort to keep in mind that this is a tough issue not only literally across the country but around the world. The Economist had an article recently reporting on efforts in China, which essentially does not have a property tax, to create one as a means of giving local governments more resources to provide services. And interestingly enough, the issue of mandates from a higher level of government is also comes into play in China. Mayor Richards and many other local officials might take some small comfort in that. The Chinese Constitution promises, quote, full play to the initiative and enthusiasm of local authorities. We don't really know what that means, but it's wonderful rhetoric. But local officials there certainly echo their counterparts here in saying that they are assigned a heavy burden of costs without the means to pay for them. But we're interested today in more than the property tax. We'll hear about the broader picture of local government fiscal challenges in New York, which predate the tax cap and go far beyond it. We're all familiar with the reality that costs in most jurisdictions are rising faster than their revenues. As you look more closely at a lot of municipalities these days, you see structural budget gaps that are not being addressed year after year, and short-term solutions of many different kinds that we can easily see are going to disappear within the next few years. Almost every local news report that I have read about local budgets around the state over the recent months has referred to fund balances being drained to get through the coming year. So it's as though in our household budgets we have drained our checking account, we're down to our last dollar in our savings account, and we're at the point in our home equity loan where the bank says, sorry, you're tapped out, we can't give you anymore. There's an increasingly strong possibility, I think, that some number, half a dozen, more perhaps, of cities and counties across the state will be coming to the legislature and the controller's office within these next few years to seek extraordinary state intervention, whether that be a control board or some other form. Unlike some states, New York does not have a consistent and comprehensive statutory system to provide early public warning of approaching fiscal crises in local governments. We end up dealing with these things on an ad hoc basis, so that, for example, the city of Newburgh has a very different level of state involvement than the city of Buffalo. And that topic itself might be a good subject for a future forum. But we are very pleased today and honored that one of the most thoughtful speakers about local government issues, fiscal and otherwise, is with us today as our first speaker. Mayor Thomas Richards of Rochester took office in April 2011 after a special election to succeed former Mayor Robert Duffy, who left City Hall to serve as Lieutenant Governor. Mr. Richards had served 4 years as City Corporation Counsel and for a brief period as Deputy Mayor. Before joining city government, he worked for more than a decade in senior executive positions at Rochester Gas and Electric Company and its parent company, RGS Energy Group, including 4 years as chairman and CEO of that corporation. He previously was an attorney in private practice. I had the pleasure of hearing Mayor Richards speak to the fiscal committees of the legislature several weeks ago, and after that I went online and Mayor, I looked up your inaugural address that you delivered last April. And for others, if you want a clear and sensible explanation of the problems facing local governments around the state, I commend this to your attention, which you can find on the city's website. There are many parts of the address I could quote, but in the interest of time, I'll just mention one. The mayor said, "There is nothing like running out of money to clarify your thinking or to help you set your priorities. What seemed impossible or undesirable before might not look so bad today compared to the other options. Mayor, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder.
No, that's okay.
Okay. End quote. And unfortunately, I think it's fair to say that in too many localities, we are refusing to clarify thinking or to set priorities. That arguably at least is our central problem when we look at local governments. Rochester does not have that problem thanks to its mayor. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Thomas Richards.
Thank you very much, Bob, and I appreciate your accommodating me. We're going back to Rochester tonight, so, and I've been in Albany for 2 days, which if you're, you know, if the other end of the state, Albany 2 days is pretty risky, and so I need to go home here in order to be safe for a little while. So that's where I'm headed. I appreciate your accommodating my able to do it. That's very interesting about China, but I'm not tempted by it, actually. And actually, no, I don't feel better that China also has a problem. But I have been thinking a lot about this, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you because there are people here who think about these things regularly, and I do think we need to think about it. That there have been some fundamental changes in the way we govern ourselves, at least the way we financially govern ourselves. And it's time to think through that a little bit. And it's time to think through it in a way that the solutions we come up with are not patches that tend to deal with what we think is just a short-term problem. So that's a little bit what I'm going to discuss today. You know, I've lived in Rochester all my life, really almost all my life, certainly all my professional life, and I've had a chance to see it in many of its iterations. Professionally, I started as a lawyer in what was then Nixon Hargrave, now Nixon Peabody, the largest law firm in the city, and we represented Eastman Kodak and Bosch and Lomb and Kodak, and Xerox, and the phone company and the gas company. We were kind of typical of what Rochester was like. And there were 60,000 people that worked for Eastman Kodak when I came back to work in the law firm. After I was in the law firm for about 20 years, part of that time as the managing partner of it, and it expanded rapidly into other cities during that time. I went to RG&E, then RGS, and wound up as a CEO, and that's a utility company. And one of the things a utility company is a very good barometer of the economics of the community because, you know, the load, the electric load, goes up and down as the demand in the community goes up and down. And so you really get you're an early indicator of what's going on. And you're also geographically constrained. So you rise and fall with that area. And so you are very much a product of that set of circumstances. So I had some time to think about that. And then after I went into public service as the lawyer, of course, I came to Rochester City and began to think about it in the same sort of way. And now as the mayor, somewhat responsible for it. So I've come to some conclusions I'd like to share with you. And I have a few less solutions than I have conclusions, but I have a few of those as well. And I do fear that Rochester and other upstate cities are approaching the point where they're going to fail financially. Eventually what that means is we'll go into some form of financial control board. Buffalo has been in a financial control board for now 6 years and doesn't seem to be able to figure out how to get out of it. But really that's not what I'm afraid of. What I'm afraid of is before you get to financial failure, before you actually run out of money and go into some form of receivership, you do a lot of damage to the sort of cultural and social environment in which you are operating. After all, the purpose of the city and of any municipality is not to make money. It is to provide services in a fiscally responsible fashion. You know, I get at the end of the year and I'm at zero, that's okay. It wasn't okay at RG&E, and it certainly wasn't okay in the law firm, but it's okay in the city if I have delivered the services that are important for life and enjoyment in that city. And so what goes first then is that cultural amenities, those things that make people want to live in urban areas. And if you wait until the city is in financial extremis, you've already done that damage. And so we need to think about this in an anticipatory way. And you can think of examples in this country. You can think of examples of where that's actually happened in other places and what it has meant to them in terms of trying to resurrect those municipalities. Now, we need to distinguish, in my mind, successful urban economic development from the structural financial problems that these cities face, and particularly our city faces. Both are important, both are essential for the long-term health, but they are, at least in this day and age, largely independent of each other. Successful economic development is essential to the well-being of the community, but it will not solve any longer the structural financial challenge that the city is presented with. We can have this anomaly with a successful regional economy, and all of these economies are regional in some fashion, and an unsuccessful city right in the middle of it. The challenge that causes this, in my mind, is a combination of the financial structure in which New York City or upstate cities are trapped, and the concentration of poverty and the demands that brings on the cities in that trap. Now, one part of the trap is our limited ability to raise revenue. The only tax that we control is the real property tax, and it has become inadequate and regressive. It maybe always was, but it is certainly that today. I'll give you an example in our particular city. We raise about $167 million, something of that nature, in real estate property tax today. We're required by law to give $119 million of that to the school district. And that's about 70% of our real estate, or 60% of our real estate base. That leaves 30%, $47 million left for everything else we do. Our pension bill this year is about $33 million. It'll be 50-something next year and 60-something the next year. By next year, we will have no real estate property tax left between pension and the mandated MOE. Now, we have other sources, obviously, or we'd be long gone by now, because we do get some sales tax, we do get some other sources. But my point here is that real estate property tax are, in the future, in my mind, is not the way to try to finance these cities. We are banging on an empty drum. It worked great 150 years ago or 100 years ago when these cities were different than they are now. We would have had a balance of industrial and commercial and residential base. Residential base used all the services, the industrial base provided all the revenue. If Kodak tears down a building that had $25 million worth of value on our rolls, it takes me $50 million worth of residential property to make it up. We've had a fundamental change in our city, and therefore we need to change the way we finance the city. And economic development, as important as it is not going to fix that problem. There are two separate problems, and they need to be worked with separately. The tax cap that you've heard about, I'm committed to living within it. And I mean the real tax cap. I mean 2%, not 2% with all these holes that are in the middle of it. And the reason I do that is not because I passed a law, but because that's realistic for my community. The average income for my community is $30,000 a year. We've been living within the tax cap for as long as I can remember. We haven't been raising taxes more than 2%, and we shouldn't, because that's the base we've got. 2% raises $3.2 million. It's dwarfed by the other obligations we have. So what you're doing there is, again, that's what I mean about banging on an empty drum. We're trying to force this solution with a tool that isn't going to work. And I think that's something that we need to get in our head and start thinking about doing different. This year, we're faced with about a $40 million deficit. We couldn't tax our way out of that if we wanted to. We have about $29 million left of taxing capacity. And even that's true, even though in Rochester, for the decade of the 90s and the early 2000s, our tax base was going down. We've managed to turn that around, and so in the last 6 years, the tax base has actually been going up. That's a very positive thing in terms of reflection of the confidence in the city, the capacity of the city to attract people, and attract investment. But it is not going to solve the city's financial problem. And if I try to solve it with that problem, I'm going to discourage the very, very prosperity that I'm trying to encourage. Another part of that financial trap is the rapidly escalating costs. And you people are in Albany, you've heard people complain. We've been coming to Albany complaining about it for a long time. You know, principal among those costs are two. One of them is pensions, and one of them is medical insurance. Our pension costs are projected to increase this year by $24 million. They're going to go to $54 million the next year and $64 million the year after that. The same is true in the same time frame. Our cost for medical insurance is going to go up almost the same amount, to about $60 to $70 million. So there we are with $140 million out of a budget of approximately $470 million. We can't pay it. We can't pay it. Mathematically, we can pay it, but we can't pay it and run a city. We can't pay it and be true to the reasons that we exist, which is to provide, an urban environment in which people can thrive. And we're not going to get the solution through the property tax, as I said before. Now, we are a city that, and one of the reasons we're in somewhat better shape than other upstate cities, is we're a city that has been conservatively managed for quite a while, and I don't get much credit for that. That's something that I'm lucky enough to inherit. We have reserves still. Syracuse has none. We've been managed conservative in the sense we've cut our workforce since the 70s. We now have 35% fewer employees, lost almost half of our employment base. Now, we've also lost population, so there's some rational adjustment there. And including in the last decade, we've taken another 12% of our employment base out. And we made some significant changes in that period that have reflected the change in our population and our demographics and our needs. So actually, the police force has actually gone up during that period of time, has actually increased. Public safety positions today represent about 70% of our total workforce headcount, firemen, police, 911. In the first budget that I had to do as a mayor, I was forced to consider layoffs of police officers and firefighters. We've been laying off other people for a long time, but in that budget, we got to the point where they too have to participate in this. Through an early retirement program and some other things, we were able to shrink the ranks enough so we didn't have to do that, although there were layoffs in other areas of the city. And the police and fire unions in Rochester are beginning to understand the problem here, I think. And in the contract we negotiated with them last year, they accepted a 1% increase for 2 years in a row. I give them credit for that. Because these are people who can force you into arbitration if they want to. And the pattern, certainly with respect to their existence here, has been 3 or 4 times that. So there is some recognition there that they have got part of the whole here and they've got to participate in it. And that's tough for a union leader. It's tough for someone to make those judgments. We've reduced spending in the last 3 budgets, and we've captured more than 10%, or almost $42 million in efficiency in the last 10 years. And we've had to one of the ways we've survived is we've shifted a lot of our financing to the charge for services. So we charge independently for rubbish collection and plowing the streets and some things like that. So we move some things off the general balance sheet. But in the long term, you can't charge for those services any more than they cost. So you're not in a position to balance your general budget deficit by charging more for rubbish collection. So they have their limits, even though they have helped with respect to the balance in some sense. The other issue that's happening here is that this is all occurring in a city that includes a significant concentration of poverty. We have one of the worst concentrations of poverty in the entire country. We're in the top 10 in many respects. It's not something I'm particularly proud of. And this is so despite the fact that our region is not poor, and that our region is not an area in which we haven't had some economic success, even in the face of some changes that have occurred in our environment. Give you a little context here. Our population has decreased since 1970 by about 30%. We used to be about 330,000, 350,000 people. We're now about 210,000 people. That's leveled off, so we're no longer losing people at that rate. But it's a significant decline, significant change. The area itself, the population has been relatively static. What you've seen there is a migration from the city to the suburbs, essentially, and the whole area remaining somewhat constant. And we've had some issues there during that period of time that drove it, and the most principal, or at least the one that people see the most, is Eastman Kodak. As I said, when I came back to Rochester in the early 70s, there were 60,000 people working there in Rochester. Now there are a little over 7,000, and it's going down rapidly, and as you probably know, they have declared bankruptcy there in Chapter 13. We don't know what's going to happen with Kodak, but we know that they're going to be much smaller if they survive bankruptcy, and they're going to be much less benevolent in terms of their ability to do things for the city. They have been very benevolent for over 100 years. And one thing about Kodak that is true is our community can complain about a lot of things, but not about the way we were treated by Eastman Kodak. And much of our prospect now is based on the fact that the people who ran that company and ran other companies like Xerox and Bosch and Lomb put a lot of the wealth they accumulated back in that community. So the U of R, RIT, Eastman School of Music, all of those were created with Kodak wealth. And so we're fortunate. People in other communities who have lost major industrial base like that are left with an empty factory. We have some of those, but we also have these institutions which now are independently successful and are the thing that really is driving our economy. And so it's not all bad news. Fortunately, it took a long time to happen. It's happened over 30 years. So much of the damage that was going to be done was already done by the time they declared bankruptcy, and the city and the community had a chance to adjust. Nonetheless, in our city, 29% of the families live below the poverty line. Their average is, as I said before, is $30,000 for a family. Owner-occupied housing is under 43%, and 4 out of the 5 children in our school system qualify for free lunch. There's a geopolitics to this in upstate New York that explains some of it. And that is that we're a place that's very easy to get around in. We brag about it all the time. I actually tell people I'm trying to slow you down slightly. You know, I want you to have to wait at the light downtown, actually. But the fact of the matter is it's a very easy place to get around. And so you can work downtown and live in one of the suburbs, and you're talking about 15 or 20 minutes, no matter where you live. And in a half an hour, you can be in the country. In 35 minutes, you can live on Canandaigua Lake. So what that's meant, in addition to the other factors that have gone on here, is we have wound up with a high concentration of poverty left in the city. The people who are there are the people who can't move. And largely, the middle class gets driven out of the city by a combination of the sort of suburban flight when it was popular, and the school district, a poorly performing school district. It's not unique, but it tends to be exacerbated in a city like ours in upstate New York because it's so easy to do. If you live in Manhattan, you have to make a real commitment to go to New Jersey. You just don't have to do that in Rochester, New York, and that's affected to a large extent the way in which this is distributed. Now, I bring that up because that's part of the lesson we got to learn here. It's not realistic. If that's going to be the geopolitics of upstate New York, and the cities are not allowed to expand, and the school district is going to remain a city school district, then that's going to have to get paid for some other way. It's unrealistic to expect those people who are trapped in that set of circumstances to pay for the demands that brings about. So that's what I say to my suburban friends. You can't walk away from this. You know, this is our problem, and we have to deal with it as our problem, and we can't let the geopolitics dictate some other kind of issue. So, despite our best efforts here that I've recited here, this financial trap and this concentration of poverty here is going to lead us to some cultural and social consequences that we're not going to like if we don't figure out another way to finance the system. I'll give you some examples of the dilemma about what I mean. A policeman, average policeman, costs about $125,000 a year. This is just a patrolman. When you add everything up, not including the potential long-term cost of the pension, but the payments that are current. So that means 2 policemen, give or take, are $250,000. I can open a branch library for $250,000. I can run a rec center for $250,000, and do. And the city in Rochester, at least, has been fortunate in the sense we've been able to preserve these rec centers and preserve these branch libraries, which we still have. But that gives you some sense of the dilemma here. We don't want to wind up in a situation where we only have cops. But that balance is a very difficult one to do, and it means something else in terms of my conversations with the unions, doesn't it? It means that I can't expect to take public safety totally off the table here and think I'm going to solve this problem, given the relative numbers. So that's what I mean about the structure. We've got a structure here where the real estate property tax, which is our tax, is no longer going to functionally solve this problem. That economic development, as important as it is and is focused on it as we are, will not fix that structure. And so we need to come up here with some new solutions about the way we do it. Or we will get, as I said before, with a prosperous community and a city that's broke in the middle of it. And that does have a long-term consequence. I mean, there are not a lot of cities that you can think of that would be in that kind of situation that are successful. People see our community as Rochester. And when they make choices about coming there and living there, are they going to work to the medical center, are they going to do one of these other things, they think of this place as Rochester. That's one of the problems, unfortunately, Buffalo's gotten into. It's gotten this reputation, and it's very hard to overcome that if you allow yourself to get in a situation where you fail. So, I support the efforts that the governor has started with respect to the tax cap because I think it makes a point. It doesn't affect us, quite frankly. It's largely in upstate New York, a matter for the suburban school districts to cope with. But it makes a good point in terms of our capacity to rely on the real property tax. We also support it with respect to the pension issues. We need to solve this pension issue or we're going to go broke. And it is not a matter of denying people a reasonable pension. It's a matter of keeping them employed and having reasonable benefits, which they're entitled to, and reasonable compensation, which they're also entitled to. The City of Rochester has laid people off to pay its pension bill. And until we get this problem solved, we're going to continue to do it. And that has some consequences, obviously. Now, we've got a couple things that are unique to Rochester that I want to make a little pitch for here, just in case somebody's here that can help me out, is that we are in a unique situation here, excuse me. Because we were more prosperous for a long time, some of the aid that's ordinarily given to us is ordinarily given to cities, AIM aid, is much less per capita in Rochester. In Buffalo's case, on a per capita base, we get almost $40 million less on a per capita base, and probably at the time those decisions were made, that might have been realistic. Our social statistics are almost identical to Buffalo. We're required by law to provide twice as much money to our school district, even though our school districts now are almost identical in size, and the social characteristics of our population, and quite frankly the performance of our school districts, is almost identical. You put those two things together, and the city of Rochester is trapped in this $90 million problem, where we're going to have a hard time getting out of it without some kind of help. And you saw some of that in the budget this year. There was a spin-up, a classic New York thing to do, but we're grateful for it. Where for Rochester, there was a $28 million spin-up. It'll net about $15 million for us. That's a recognition, I think, of this disparity, and that's part of what I think needs to be done here. I don't personally see another solution here other than to shift the cost of maintaining these municipalities to a broader base. I don't. I'm happy to hear another solution here. I'm happy to hear another way of doing it within that. But fundamentally, that's what's going to have to happen here. And how we do it, we can debate. Whether AIM aid is the right way to do it, I suppose we can debate. But we're going to have to make that shift. And we better get about it. Or in the next several years, you will see all of the upstate cities in receivership. And I hope that's not our plan here. I hope that's not our plan. That's why, we're down here supporting any kind of mandate relief that we can get in place, why we're trying to be realistic about the benefits that we can provide, and we're looking for another source of revenue. And making people understand that economic development is an important part of what we need to do, but it does not solve this problem. This problem has to be solved independently. The example of that, I think, is probably Buffalo. And Buffalo is going to get $1 million for economic development. I'm glad they're getting it. I'm happy for them. But they're still going to be broke as a city, because that's not going to translate, as it won't for us, into a solution for these problems. So hopefully make a little progress there to slow people down a little bit and start thinking about it. The pension reform does help us in, and one thing I want to say here that's not to be lost, but it is true that the current proposal for pension reform does not solve today's problem. That's almost a separate problem. And I told you how fast our pension costs are ramping up. But it does do something that, if there are no other solutions, will help us, and that is that it takes that curve. The goes up to about $62 million and then gradually begins to go down as these other tiers kick in and some of the problem with the investment performance gets out of the system. It does help that curve go down. And if the only solution that's going to be afforded to us is to borrow money from the pension plan and amortize, which is what we're allowed to do now. We can borrow money to pay our pension obligation and then basically pay it over time. That is a lousy solution, but you know, if it's that or going broke, you're going to do it. My point here is that by increasing these tiers out here, as that decline is steeper, I've got room out there to amortize this peak without having a really high payment still out in 2 or 3 years and being trapped in this problem. It's not an ideal solution, and I wasn't the one I would have picked, but it does have an immediate impact for us, and it does help us rationalize at least this process that we're probably going to get forced into because we don't have the money to pay that obligation. And I'm not squirming about that obligation. I mean, there are lots of reasons why the pension obligation is too high. Maybe the benefits are too high. Maybe we made some mistakes about whether people should contribute, whether the city at one point in time should contribute. But I mean, there is an ethical issue here we got to be honest with ourselves about. We have promised these people these benefits. And just because it's painful, I don't know that we're allowed to get out of it. There's a constitutional provision too, but I do think there's an ethical issue here that we need to deal with. And I think as we make these decisions about finances, that has to be part of what happens. And I think, you know, I'm willing to come to grips with that and to take responsibility for it, as long as it's not perpetuated forever and there is no solution out there. So lastly, this. There really is a political issue here, isn't there? I mean, government finances are inherently political, whether you like that or not. And the political issue, it seems to me, that we're facing here is that our escalating government expense has collided with our capacity and, for that matter, our willingness to pay for it. That's the inherent political problem that underlies what I've discussed with you today. And it's at all layers of government. You've heard it debated across the country. But in the city's case, it has some particular characteristics. We're the provider of basic essential services. There's very little that we provide that people think we shouldn't do. We should pick up the trash. When you call, a policeman and the fireman should come. There are not a lot of things that we do that people want to do away with. And so it gives us less flexibility, quite frankly, with respect to changing the nature of government at that level. We have to balance our budget, which is a good requirement. We can't borrow to finance it, and we can't print money. All of our cities in upstate New York are smaller, and we have a concentration of poverty. And that puts obligations on us that maybe didn't exist in the same balance 25 years ago. And the significance of the only source of revenue that we have here, the real property tax, has declined. It's inherently regressive, as I said before, and as far as I'm concerned, it's outmoded as a way to finance municipal government. You put it all together and we get this structural financial problem. That's an interesting technical term. It doesn't do justice to what it takes to balance the budget when you have to do it. A lot of this has been blamed on public employees. I think that's misplaced, quite frankly. I've worked in a lot of places. I've been responsible for employees in a lot of places. And public employees in the city of Rochester are as good as any of those places. Many of them work very hard. Lots of them take very high risks on our behalf. So this demonization of the public employees has been a serious mistake. I think it's made this conversation very difficult to have, quite frankly, in a sensible fashion. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that things don't have to change and that it doesn't have an impact on public employees. Public employees are part of the city, this whole that's the city, and the city has to survive and be successful, but they're going to be that. But it isn't that they're evil people trying to take advantage of us. And the sooner we get off that conversation, in my own mind, the more useful the conversation is going to be. But it's going to have to be direct. And it's going to have to mean that all of us take some responsibility for it. It does not excuse them from participating in the solution. To tell you the truth, though, to finish up here, I actually am kind of optimistic about where we are. Now, you say that you wouldn't take that from anything I've said so far here, but I mean, first of all, you have to be optimistic to do this job. You know, I mean, this is a self-inflicted wound. I ran for this job here, so So you have to kind of believe that you can make a difference here. I've said it before, and it was quoted earlier, there's nothing like going broke to clarify your thinking. And the school district and the city and the county, we all have deficits, you know, and so there is a conversation that wouldn't have occurred 5 years ago. And it's not a nice way to do it, but it's probably a good thing. I told you that the unions, at least in our case, are beginning to get the message here that they're going to have to contribute to the solution. They're going to have to reduce their demands if they want to be successful in this environment, stay employed. The state is at least talking about pension reform, and as much as it's a contentious, difficult issue down here, the fact that it is a contentious, difficult issue is a sign that, you know, there's an issue here that needs to be dealt with. Even the country's beginning to grapple with healthcare issues. You know, I can't solve that problem, and neither can the state of New York. But the country is beginning to realize that this is a problem that has to be dealt with. In Rochester's case, as I said before, I'm optimistic because despite all these changes that have occurred to us, we have a solid industrial base, solid institutional base, excuse me. An institutional base that's well suited for the new economy. It's the knowledge economy. And if you wanted to be successful in a knowledge economy, you would create the kind of institutions that are successful in our community. The University of Rochester, RIT, 18 colleges and universities within 20 minutes of us. Those are all assets that you'd want to create if you wanted to participate. So we've got some work to do here. We've got some work to do with the state. We've got some work to do with the way we change the way we finance these cities. But I think it's a good investment. And I think that it's fair to hold us responsible for making sure that the money that we get through other sources is used wisely. But I think it's a good investment because we have a base here, we have the opportunity here to be, in fact, a successful community if we're honest with ourselves about the structural change and we, in fact, do change it. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I always feel better when I get to rant and rave about this, and even though it doesn't make much difference. Even though it doesn't make much difference. Sure, I'd be happy to answer questions.
The mayor does have to get back to home base, but you mentioned the institutions in Rochester that are so important. If I recall correctly, I think I read that University of Rochester Medical Center is the largest employer in the region.
It is, now employs over 20,000 people.
It's been suggested by some that cities might benefit by finding ways to get more support in the form of pilot payments or otherwise from large hospitals, educational institutions, and so on. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. You know, we have about 30% of our real estate property tax base is exempt, and that's everything. That's churches and museums and the large things like the U of R. RIT is not actually in the city, but the U of R is, and the medical center is. I think Syracuse is like 50% tax exempt. I don't know what you would do if you were 50%. Thank God I don't have that problem. But I'm in two minds about it, really, because, you know, I said before, one of the reasons that we're successful is we have these institutions that are driving our community. And I'm not interested in discouraging them because they're the best thing we have going for us. There are ways in which we have successfully gotten them to contribute. Remember I said we went to charge for separate services, embellishments basically, snow plowing, some kinds of street repair, a bunch of other things like that. Water is, of course, billed separately. They pay all of those. So to the extent we moved a significant amount of our cost base into these embellishments, we have been able to capture those people as contributors. So they contribute more, you know, millions of dollars, really, to our base. And I think for the present, I'd like to stick with that. Let me give you another example. I mean, U of R is located out the river along Hope Avenue, for those of you who know. And the neighborhood that abuts that, the South Wedge neighborhood, is the neighborhood that has grown the most rapidly. It's got now a commercial strip and an entertainment strip and a lot of houses that are being refurbished, largely driven by the population base that's the U of R and the medical center. Property values in that place went up 15% in the last assessment. So, you know, I gotta balance my way through it. But, you know, again, if we get them to make a contribution, it shouldn't be through the real estate property tax. It should be another way. another way to reflect the burden that they put on the community and some obligation of them to pay for that burden. Not how much property they own and the buildings they have. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Kathy Sheehan, I'm the treasurer for the city of Albany.
Oh, good, then you know all about this, right?
We have 60% of our property that's off the tax rolls, and for us, because we have homestead and non-homestead rates, the more compelling number is that 80% of our non-residential property is not taxable. And to your point about the institutions that really make the Rochester area such a desirable area, the city of Albany hosts the three hospitals, 2 major medical centers, the University of Albany. A lot of the institutions, our population almost doubles in size with employees who come in here to work, and we need to provide obviously public safety and safe streets and plow the snow off the streets for those people. So what you were talking about as far as the regional benefit and looking out to our suburban communities that really benefit from the city being here, have you had much traction in that? One of the statistics that I look at is that 5% of our property is non-taxable because it's public housing. We welcome ourselves, we welcome people who are less fortunate and they reside here in the city, but there is a cost to that, and it's very expensive. So have you had much traction with your suburban neighbors in trying to have a broader look at how we finance our cities?
We've had some in Rochester that maybe is a little unique. I don't know about Albany, but we do share sales tax. What's kept us afloat? I gave you those numbers about the real property tax, and if you're doing the math in your head, you're saying he's got to be making that up, or we'd be broke. And the reason we're not broke is we share the sales tax with Monroe County at a fairly high degree. We get about $120 million worth of sales tax, and that comes across the whole county. So there's an example of a set of circumstances in which really helps us, and general economic increase in conditions benefits. And so the malls, for instance, that have taken the shopping away from downtown, that sales tax is now in those malls, but we benefit from it. So that's an example, a good example of it. Again, I told you about the embellishments with respect to the not-for-profit properties. That's helped. And I think Rochester probably is the farthest along in that of any cities. We did it when people weren't looking. You know, back a long time ago. It's tough to get in play, as you know. It's very tough to try to do it now when times are tougher. Something that I've encouraged the U of R to do, and they have done, is to do some of the development that they do that is not academic, like student housing. We're building a college town along Mount Hope, which is a combination of all kinds of things, but really, really driven by the U of R. I've encouraged them to do it through a private developer. And while we will enter into a tax abatement agreement with them, the tax abatement agreement nonetheless generates tax revenue for us we would not otherwise get. And they've done that for a couple of their dorms now. There are reasons for them to do it, you know, on their own, in terms of their own balance sheet and their own borrowing capacity. And it generates some level of revenue for us. So we've encouraged that. You got to work with them to do that. You got to be willing to come up with a different structure here, and be willing to support it. But it has had some pretty significant impact on us. So those are a couple ideas we have. But to change the basic fundamental proposition, probably not.
Mayor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you folks.
Well, one thing that we want to do here, I'm sorry, because Gary went all the way back to the car to get it. We, of course, have some propaganda that we put together about our plight here. And so we'll leave copies of it for you. They're left in the back. I appreciate your picking it up. It has beautiful pictures of Rochester, so I hope you fall in love with it and come live there.
And I want to note that Peter Baines from the Conference of Mayors is in the room, and the Conference of Mayors either is now completing or recently completed a survey of its members across the state with some very good data on the challenges facing mayors and other municipal officials around New York State. We will now ask Steve Hancox to give us his perspectives on, and I think we need to get his PowerPoint up, Michelle, if we could. We've talked about, we heard the mayor refer to the likelihood that many municipalities in the state may be approaching very significant problems of the kind that might have them knocking on Steve Hancox's door. When local governments do get in trouble and need help identifying the way out, very often they end up talking to the experts in the Office of the State Comptroller, which has very broad responsibilities for overseeing the finances of local governments around the state. And Steve Hancox is the key official leading all of that on behalf of Controller Tom DiNapoli. He is the Deputy New York State Comptroller for the Division of Local Government and School Accountability. Steve has served in the State Comptroller's office for 32 years, and since March 2000, he has overseen all the audits and other services for local governments and school districts by the Comptroller's office, currently overseeing a staff of 300 in Albany and 7 regional offices around the state. When the legislature passed the tax cap, they gave the Comptroller's office, Steve and his colleagues, a lot of work to do in seeing that it was implemented correctly. And Steve is going to give us some insights on that today. Steve?
Thank you. Before I get into tax cap issues, sorry. Bob, I thought you had a great idea about the issue of financial oversight, financial control boards of the state. I'd be happy to come back and talk about that at some point in time, because I was intimately involved in the creation of both the Erie County and the City of Buffalo's control board. Also was very involved with the very light oversight that the City of Newburgh was implemented in the City of Newburgh. And it's been interesting because probably in the last 3 or 4 months, I've had conversations with about half a dozen localities around the state, cities and counties, with a discussion about the control board issue. And it's really a very misunderstood issue about how they work, how they're created, their powers. So that would be kind of an interesting topic, I think. And I'm glad you asked the question to the mayor about pilots, because I want to talk about that. So, probably the other speakers today are going to talk to you a lot about some of the policy issues of the tax cap. I'm not. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the tax cap. The Comptroller's office, Comptroller DiNapoli supported the tax cap. It basically said it should be coupled with significant mandate reform. That didn't occur, and he's spoken about that. But outside of that, we didn't have a particular view on the tax cap. It is the Governor Cuomo's, he's touted it as one of his significant achievements last year. But it's interesting, he took all the credit, but the legislation gave us a lot of the responsibility for the implementation and interpretation of the cap. So, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we have seen so far, and then what, in my opinion, we will see in the future. And pilot issues, I think, are going to become a major issue there. So, also, I want to make sure you understand there's 2 tax cap legislations. There's one for municipalities, and there was a separate one for schools. We were given significant role for municipalities. We have a lesser role for schools. SED has a much more significant role in terms of the implementation of the cap. And I don't have much to talk about schools yet, because today, schools should start submitting their data to us. March 1st there. Every school district in the state is mandated to submit their data to us today. Yesterday we had about 20, so I expect 677 of them. Tax cap had a broad effect across the state. I just want to point out here special districts, 67 special, there's hundreds of special districts, but the tax cap and the governor's interpretation of the tax cap rolls, if a special district is governed by the town board, it is rolled up under the town's tax cap. They are not separate individual levy limits for each one of the special districts, which is kind of an interesting anomaly. We'll see how that plays out. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So, we had 4 major roles in the tax cap. We had to develop, everybody had to report to us in a manner prescribed by us. We developed a web-based reporting system in a hurry. Got that in place by September of last year and started collecting data. You need to keep in mind that municipalities so far, only required to report to us their levy limit, the calculation of their levy limit, not their actual levy. They report to us their actual levy in other manner, and we are starting to collect that data, but I only have partial information about what the actual levies have been versus their levy limit. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Another major role for us was if a municipality exceeded their tax cap inappropriately, meaning they didn't do an override. Now, keep in mind, if they do an override, all bets are, they can do anything they want. Do an override, you can raise your taxes 100%, do whatever you want. But if you don't do an override and you exceed the calculated levy limit, we require you, the state controller is required, that they will set up a reserve, fund that reserve with cash with any excess levy that they've incurred. Our number one goal last fall was we do not want to do that. We do not want to go out and find a municipality that raised money either inappropriate, but by mistake, they made an honest error, or they didn't make an honest error, and that we would have to take the money from them, disrupt their budget, and make them put it into a reserve, taxpayer money, and then leave it there for a year, and then they use it to defray next year's levy. So we did a significant amount of training last fall. We trained thousands of local officials. We did webinars. We did regional seminars. We talked to people. And then in December of last year, we went out on the ground at about 800 locations around the state. Actually, I had people, we stopped all our audits, and took all my auditors, and we sent them out to every location that we thought were of a higher risk, and said, we're going to look at your calculation. We're going to look at this was after they had adopted their budget. Usually most towns, and certainly fire districts by the end of November, have adopted the budget. We're going to look at your adopted budget, look at what the actual levy is, see if you stayed and lived with the cap, or you didn't live with the cap. And then what we told them to do in December, if we found that they hadn't lived with the cap, is lower your levy. Because we're going to be back there on January 2nd, and we're going to make you take the extra money and put it into a reserve. And a number of places did that, even though there's no legal way for them to do that, they actually did it. And we also have, if a municipality is either transfer functions, meaning a city decides to turn over its 911 dispatch to the county, transfer of functions, the cost implications, impact on the tax base, we determine this, if the city gives away its 911, has the county take it over, the city's costs go down, and their levy limit goes down, and the county's goes up. Or consolidation dissolution. We did about 20 to 30 transfers of functions. They go on all the time. Again, I think the tax cap's going to have some impact on that going forward. There were a small handful of villages that dissolved this year, and that also impacts the resulting tax caps. So far, and the two lines here to look at really are cities and fire districts, or excuse me, towns and fire districts. This is those who have reported their data to us. So all towns should be in by now, all fire districts should be in by now. You can see we only have 92%. We have this 8% non-compliance, and we have called, we have emailed, we have threatened. We'll probably always have an 8% non-compliance, I'm going to guess. So those are kind of, the other ones, the villages, the cities, they're still coming in because it's based on their fiscal years. Not every city, Rochester, for example, will not have filed with us yet. They'll have a school year, fiscal year, July 1st. Same villages are just getting into it. So I thought it was interesting that no matter our best efforts, the governor's best efforts, we only have about a 92% compliance rate with filing their data with us. The other number that has stayed fairly constant are those who tell us they plan to override. Doesn't mean they have to override. But we asked them when we asked them to report their data, let us know if you think you're going to override. And about 20% said they were, and as it turns out, about 20% did. I told you we went out and looked at almost 800 places across the state. Found about 5% who exceeded their levy, did not correct their levy, even though we asked them, we thought they should. And we went out on early January, recalculated, make sure everything was proper, correct, and sent them letters and told them they had to put that extra money into a reserve for next year. And it's actually not, while it's 5%, again, this is only 800, there's several thousands who have already, this tax cap has impacted this sample, and it's a little bit It's not a random sample, because we did look a little bit at some higher risk places. That's a pretty big number. Only about $500,000 of excess levy that we haven't put into reserves. A couple, 2% who who in December they actually lowered their levy and adjusted their budgets before they actually issued tax bills. This is another interesting issue of the ones who actually did a calculation. So if they did an override, we didn't look at the calculation because it didn't mean anything to us. And then there were a number of those who did not do a calculation. But of those who did a calculation, only a third of them got it right. That's despite our best efforts. Thousands of people we did training, all these webinars, we sent out guidance, the governor's office posted guidance. Only a third of them did it right, calculated it accurately, which it's a little complicated. We're going to talk about why some errors were made. But fortunately for the ones who actually didn't calculate it right, most of them stayed under the levy anyways. So there were a series of common errors that we identified. These 5, when you say, well, geez, how come they can't calculate the prior year levy properly? At least that number should be fairly obvious to people. Well, like I said, I mentioned like special districts. If you're a special district and the town board is the board of the special district, it has to be rolled up under the town. And so its levy from the prior year needs to be brought into the calculation. Lots of places can understand that. There's a variety of factors that come into play. There's district issues, as well as sales tax offset and the chargebacks. The tax levy law is about 3 pages long. There are about 10,000 variations of what happens in local governments. And that's not even counting schools yet. We haven't got to schools yet. And those variations didn't mean anything prior to this. So, for example, chargebacks. I mean, counties can charge back certain costs to municipalities within the county. And I use community colleges. There is a community college cost to a county, and they can charge that back to the towns based on the number of students who are attending community colleges. Some counties, what they do is they put it on the tax bill. Some counties send a bill to the town, and the town sends a bill. Some counties put it on the tax bill. They figure out what the amount is, and then they levy it against the residents of that town. They actually put the bill, that levy, if you've ever seen a tax, where you've got tax bills, there's, a dozen lines on the tax bill, like people, various counties like to break out various aspects, say with the Medicaid taxes or whatever it might be. And so they break out and put it in the town grouping, a levy for community colleges. Question becomes, whose levy is that? Because now that matters. It didn't matter before, who cared? Now it's a tax cap levy, you got to calculate the limit. Whose levy is that? Counties thought, well, it's the town's levy, because we're levying against the town employees, or town residents, excuse me. But it isn't. It's a county levy because it's the county who's putting it on the tax bill. Right? So there's all these variety of variations. The other variation is sales tax offset. There are some towns who get so much sales tax that they don't know what to do with it. Because they don't have that many costs. Cleveland Park is an example of a place that has little, if any, property tax, and they get the sales tax, and it's more than the cost of running the town government. And so some towns tell the county, look, what we want you to do with our extra sales tax is offset the county levy against our town residents. So if the county was going to levy $1 million against that town's residents, there's $200,000 in sales tax offset that the county has. The county actually lowers its levy to $800,000. Now, the county believed that they had $1 million levy, but they don't. They have an $800,000 levy, because that's what was levied against those people, those residents. Right? So there's a whole bunch of, and then these are just 2 variations, which are going to come into play a bit in another minute. But so lots of places could not figure out, or made errors in what was the prior year levy. Tax-based growth factor, these are given to everybody by tax and finance. In the first year, because of the timing of getting this up and running, we were unable to pre-populate the form for everybody's tax growth factor. Going forward, we will be able to do that. We have a arrangement with tax and finance. But in the first year, they picked up the wrong number. They chose not to use tax and finance's number. They computed the number on their own for some reason. They had it less than 1, it can never be less than 1. I hate to talk about pension today. The controller told me I wasn't allowed to talk about pension. But there was errors in the calculation of the pension exclusion. Again, the language of the law says if there's an increase in the pension rate of more than 2%. If your pension rate was 10% last year, and it's 12% next year, that is a 20% increase in your cost. But it's only a 2% change in the rate. Right? There's a lot of confusion about that issue, despite the fact that we have on our website, we have a spreadsheet trying to walk people through how to do their calculation. We found lots of places that had a little trouble doing the pension exclusion calculations. Pilots, you would think would be easy. Pilots. Bob asked the mayor about pilots. I mean, increasing his pilots is a way to help them. Pilots are, in the legislation, are wrapped up into property taxes. The way you do your calculation, in a simple way, is you take your levy, add last year's pilots, whatever that number is, then you get to add the 2% factor, the inflationary factor, tax growth factor also. You subtract out what you expect to get next year in pilots, and then that's your levy, your real property levy limit. So pilots are now just considered as part of the, if you will, in the calculation, it's just part of the calculation for property taxes. So if your pilots go up, if you go out next year and bring in Global Foundries, we turn over the park here to Global Foundries, I may like to do that, and get a big pilot payment, it doesn't help you, because you're going to have to subtract that out of your calculated base, and you're going to actually raise less property taxes, because it's considered part of the property tax. If you do an override, you can do whatever you want. So, pilots in and of themselves, without the override, won't help. Growth in pilots won't help them. Oops, got it upside down. We're interested to try to figure out the impact. You know, we're the collectors of this data. We're the enforcers of it. We are interested as we go forward to see what the impact is on the property taxes. And this is a little bit of skewed data. For those that did not override, they're on average, the levy limit, the calculated limit, it's not 2%, as somebody said earlier. You get these exclusions. So actually, for the ones that we looked at, 3.3% was the levy limit growth. They only averaged a budget levy increase of 0.7%. Now, this doesn't include those that did the override, which probably exceeded the 3.3%. Yes, right. Actually, counties, the Association of Counties did surveyed all their members. Their numbers were about 3.8% was the levy growth limit, and they went up about 3.1%. So a little bit bigger growth in counties. But it doesn't bring in the override people yet. So we're still going to gather that data. We'll see. We'd like to see whether this really changes the needle much. It's a little hard to figure out what the trend line is, but we want to see how that plays out over the years. Other impacts. I think you're going to see a significant number of unintended consequences. Because you're going to have to, local governments are going to have to rethink some of these issues. And their first, I believe, their first way is going to look, how can I work within the cap and exploit, I don't want to call them loopholes, but loopholes. You're going to see fee for services. Again, the mayor here mentioned the idea. In a city the size of Rochester, mayor may not raise much money. Budgets are always on the margin. If I told him you could raise $10 million through fees, not much on a budget of $400 million, but it's on the margins. City of Schenectady, about 10 years ago, created a garbage district. Took their garbage collection out of city services, put it on a fee basis, raised about $5 or $6 million for the city of Schenectady. That was significant for them. So I think you're going to see lots of municipalities explore the issue of what can we start charging specific fees, and that be fees that be based on a usage charge. So you see that. The chargebacks, you already saw Suffolk County propose it this year. I assume you're going to see many counties start to change the way they do their chargebacks. It would benefit the county if they actually just sent a bill, which is great, because the county already got it built into their tax base in prior years. And now if they start billing for it, they can cost shift off to the municipalities. So I think you'll see the pressure on counties to do that. And on the flip side is, you're going to see towns then say, hey, forget the sales tax offset, just give me the money. And you're going to, the county will then suffer the negative consequences of that. Pilots, I think you'll see municipalities rethink pilots. You're not going to benefit, municipalities will not benefit from a significant growth in pilots. And in fact, the Burnt Hill school system already came in to talk to me about the impact of the Global Foundries pilot on them. It's so big compared to the rest of their levy, and it goes up and down for whatever negotiated reasons, and it's going to drive their acceptable but unexplainable to the public tax levy. They're going to, when they calculate it, they're going to have a 8% growth, 10% growth in tax levy. That's going to be allowable under the limit, but to explain that to an individual taxpayer who thinks they are operating under a 2% levy limit is going to be nearly impossible. Special districts, now that towns realize that they are going to be either blessed or burdened with special district, depending on how it works for them, they will look to exploit that or utilize it to their best advantage. Transfer of functions. If a municipality transfers a function, as a transfer of function, they, City of Utica, we give up their 9/11 dispatch, it was costing about $250,000. What used to happen back then, prior to the tax levy limit legislation, was the county would want to help out their city and say, hey, we'll take that over for you. You're going to save a couple $100,000. Use that to pay your police force or pick up the garbage or whatever you do. That doesn't not the way it works anymore. City of Utica, they have a cost savings of $250,000. Their levy limit has to go down by $250,000. They get no financial benefit for the transfer of function. So I think what you'll see there, actually, if the city would pay for it, it's not a transfer of function. It's just outsourcing. So if the city actually made a payment to the county, then it's not a transfer of function. We don't come in and do the calculation. So if they want to pay the county $50,000 to pick up the 9/11 dispatch, they save $250,000. Right? So that actually they're now they get the benefit of this extra $200,000. I think you'll see both that as well as Mayor didn't mention it, but I just think you're going to see long-term as people burn up their fund balance. They're going to use all these resources. They're going to use these various things. They're going to try to figure out how to maximize it. But at the end of the day, sometime, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you kind of run out of squeezing all the juice out of all that. And then you're going to have to significantly look at how you restructure government and operate. Because as you see, I'm sure you get a parade of local officials up here that says they can't live with a 2% cap for long. Right? They just can't have that kind of reining in other revenues. Which, and again, perhaps the real intended impact of the legislation was to get people to really rethink the restructuring and how you deliver services, looking at regionalization issues and stuff. So I'm trying to, I'm an auditor, and that means I'm really anal. So Bob gave us some broad parameters. He said they were guidelines, but I thought of them as rigid parameters in terms of time, Bob, so I tried to stay within that time. If I come back in a year, I'll have a lot more data that will have collected and analyzed and be able to say, what was the impact and how is this really playing out? We are doing this on the fly. The governor gave us all this responsibility and so far hasn't given us any extra bodies to do the work.
On that note.
I see a question, Bob, a little bit.
Can I ask a question? Hi, I'm Gail Hopper from the Chamber of Schenectady County. And do I need it? I was meeting with the mayor the other day from the village of Scotia, and we were talking about the tax cap, and he let me know that the local village business improvement district was looking to increase their assessment, and that he was claiming would affect his levy. They have separate boards. The bid is claiming that it won't affect the city or the village. so there's a little squabble going on there, and I was wondering if you could give me some direction on who is right, where we could find the answer, and,
I'm almost positive in this case, but there's always a little bit of a fact pattern that needs to be determined. I'm almost positive that bids are under the municipality, even though they don't have, they have separate boards, potentially that the bid would be under the municipality. But again, there are some fact issues that we have to look at.
can I call your office? And
Sure, absolutely.
thank you.
I'm afraid, in the interest of time, we're going to have to say, Steve, thank you very much, and we'll look forward to having you back, if not a year from now, perhaps sooner. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is the guy we're going to blame for all the fiscal problems facing local governments, because they're all losing their tax base, and it's all Jim Follain's fault. He's going to try to convince us that it's not. But Jim is a senior fellow here at the Institute. He's an economist with extensive academic and other professional experience in the empirical analysis of housing and mortgage markets and public policies that affect them. He has conducted research and written on the risks of mortgage lending, the tax treatment of housing, mortgage choice, suburbanization, property and land taxes, and the current mortgage crisis. Jim has been a professor of economics and finance at the University of Illinois and at Syracuse University. He's also worked at the Federal Reserve, the Urban Institute, and the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation. His resume, his CV says Freddie Mac. I had to go look up what that stood for. But even their website just says Freddie Mac. You can't find it. You have to go look at Wikipedia. Jim has a doctorate in economics from the University of California, Davis. Jim, take it away.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate being asked to be part of this. I think I share what many of you share, we're going to hear, and I've already heard. There's a serious fiscal crisis facing us. And to be part of that discussion, I feel very fortunate. My good friend Bob Ward gave me 10 minutes, so I want to make sure I get across my main comments, and then I can refer you to the PowerPoint or to a paper that's going to be posted, please.
Okay, we got 2 mics going there.
Okay. One Jim, 2 mics.
There we go, thank you.
Well, there are 2 Jims. No, we get confused. So that I share that perspective. There's a problem. There's a different perspective, though, that I bring, and I wanted to try to talk a little bit about that at the beginning. The subtitle of the PowerPoint presentation is the property tax levy has stopped the bleeding, but now it's time to cure the patient. So the patient that I have in mind is not local government. That's a very important issue. But it's the property tax, or in particular the owner of the property who pays the property tax. I think there's some serious problems that need to be addressed. And the other kind of perspective that's a little different perhaps that I bring, I've been working on housing and mortgage markets for a long time. And I want to kind of bring some of that perspective to this debate about the property tax. And there are two aspects of that I want to highlight here. One is I've done a lot of work on detecting stressful events in the future. So did a lot of work on bank capital and things of that sort, and I've written about this a lot. One of the takeaways, institutions have a very difficult time coming to grips with extreme events. Just can document that left and right, and I think it's very much being played out in this discussion about fiscal conditions of state and local government. There's a problem coming, and we have to be, my hope is some of these data crunching exercises that I'm doing kind of raises awareness of the issue, and we can take steps to address it before the really bad stuff happens. And the Great Recession and all the house price bubble are examples. All the large banks that fail, things of that sort, are things that we can perhaps do something about if we start acting a little better now. The second part, and this is the more specific technical kind of stuff, I've written a lot about what happens to real estate markets when they're in decline. So upstate New York is full of these. I lived in Syracuse for many years in here. And there's a new kind of declining city growing out in the California area that's been really hit hard by the current crisis. And I think I want to kind of bring some of the lessons being learned from that to this discussion about the property tax. And what two big kind of empirical facts are: house prices have come down in an unprecedented way. I've lived through the S&L crisis of the early 80s. What we're talking about now is a different order of magnitude. And the second thing is, it really makes it hard for the property tax. Kind of the number of sales has really plummeted. That makes the job of assessors and property people value property much, much harder. And there's a lot of work being done on that. One good sign is, I think there are massive amounts of data and statistical methods being used that I'd like to see New York State consider as well. Just a little background, a little context. If you're from upstate, this is not really much of a shocker, but I looked at the American Community Survey, which asked people, how much do you pay in property taxes and what's the value of your house? And then I take I've got 650 counties, and then I rank them. Which counties have the highest median property tax payments? Downstate just overwhelms. So Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, they're all approaching $10,000 a median, up from about $8,000 in 2005. And then if you rank them by the property tax rate, that's kind of the amount of the taxes divided by the value of the property, upstate comes up. And they're at the top in terms of that effective property tax rate. And so many of them are approaching 3%, and they've actually increased since 2005. That's the context. So a lot of people talk about, well, house prices have declined here a bit in New York, but nothing like California. That's true, but I'm going to show you some evidence that they've fallen pretty dramatically in parts of New York State as well. Here's kind of a standard way of looking at the story, perhaps, that highlights the fact that New York was not hit as bad. The top, the one that goes up really high is LA. So you see prices going from 2000 up, more than doubling. I don't have the index on there, sorry, but they more than doubled. And then they plummeted by, in many places, more than 50%. New York didn't have that on average. The one at the one that's the lowest at the bottom is Phoenix, another one of these places in the Sand States. And they're back to where they were 10 years ago. They've lost all of those gains on average. New York is the one in the middle, didn't go up nearly as high on average, didn't come down nearly as far. So, you know, one of the things you hear in New York is, wow, we could have been, we're not California, or we're not Nevada. True. But here's another part of the story. What's happened in the Great Recession is certain tiers of the housing market have been hit a lot harder than others, in particular the low tier, where there was a lot of subprime lending, kind of fueling a lot of that excess demand. So that top curve, these are all indexes for the New York commuter area, a lot of the New Jersey, some of the counties around the New York City metropolitan area, Case-Shiller price indexes. And what they've consistently shown, and what they show in New York as well, is in that lower tier, house prices have declined dramatically. You're talking about that it reached a peak in the low tier around 2006 at 160% of their values in 2000. And they're down to, they've basically fallen by about half. That's not me. I'm going to show you some data that I used to estimate what's going on in smaller places. This is a Case-Shiller widely used index, but parts of New York have been hit very hard too. Let's see here. One of the other facts about the current situation is the number of sales available to do serious, measurement of house prices has gone down. This is for, again, Phoenix, LA, and New York, and you see the main story is in all of them, you've seen a tremendous reduction in the number. These are the number of sales available to estimate the Case-Shiller price index. That's been a kind of a factoid of this particular period we're living through. So what I do, you have a paper outside I've been using some data provided by the Office of Real Estate Property Services. Jim Dunn has been very helpful and helped me understand it and use it as a phenomenal data set. And it has all the transactions in New York State over the last 10 years. And I've kind of used that data to do the kind of thing Case-Shiller does, estimate weighted repeat sales indexes and look at the number of sales. And the goal is to go down more granular. Not the New York metropolitan area, but pick some of the counties that have been hit really hard and then take a deeper dive. How low can we go in some sense to municipalities within those? Because, you know, underlying the kind of sad story about the housing market is the really great news going on about kind of this data revolution that we're living in. It's, I work with a firm out in Hawaii who does a lot of this. He puts a value on every housing unit in the country, like 100 million units. I mean, this is just not the kind of stuff that could have been done when I was a young man. So what I do in the paper is I look at 6 counties, 4 downstate, 2 upstate. Here's Suffolk County. So these are estimates of the price index for these places. The main takeaway is they've all declined substantially. 100% is about where they were in 2004. That's kind of the index. And they're all down now 20 to 30%. So it has hit this place, Suffolk County. And those are the 3 largest municipalities in Suffolk County have been hit pretty hard too. This is about the number of sales. The top one is the total number of sales. The bottom part is how many are available for these repeat sales indexes. And you see just a dramatic decline in Suffolk County. It makes their job much, much harder if their goal was to come up with estimates of market value. This is, now I've done this for 6 counties. So this is the price index for 6 counties. The 2 at the bottom are Orange and Suffolk. The 2 in the middle are Nassau and Westchester. And the 2 at the top are Albany and Schenectady. So Albany and Schenectady has not been hit as hard in the last 5 or 6 years, but substantial reductions from their peaks, 20+% in those other areas. That's, I think, a very defensible, important finding. Let's see. More numbers on sales. One of the challenges in today's market is dealing with distressed sales. Typically in property tax work, there's a focus on kind of squeaky clean sales where there's no there's no kind of relationship within the parties. There's not a sale that involves a lender one way or another. Historically, this is a very good way of doing business. You deal with arm's length transactions. You get a better estimate of the market value of property that way. And going back historically, you're talking about just several percent of all sales falling into this. It's not the case now. Some of these markets, you're talking about 30, 40, 50% of the sales are distressed. So throwing them out comes at a cost. And so one of the ways that many people are working on this is to try to figure out which ones to use. What I did, I went back to the state data for Orange County, and I included REO sales, real estate owned. That's usually when the lender, who's already foreclosed on the borrower, owns the property and sells it to an objective third party. And what happens when I update this through 2000, parts of early 11, I get the same pattern. Orange County's going down, and those REO sales are contributing to it even more. So I think my suggestion to Jim and those investors generally, let's rethink some of the ways we've done this in the past, because I have this concern that we're not really addressing the decline that you would find if you include a lot of these distressed sales. Couple of the policy implications, just a few thoughts. I looked at, one question is whether assessed values, one story is that maybe on the way up, assessed values didn't grow quite as fast, and they're not adjusting quite as fast on the way down, a logical possibility. I started looking at assessed records in some of the counties. Orange County, it's not the case. If you look at assessed values, adjusted for market values, you find that for the same 65,700 properties I looked at, the assessed value of the property tax actually went up. So there wasn't that kind of adjustment that you might have expected to see. Those are more details. Possible next steps. I think there's a lot more work that can be done on this. I hope to have an opportunity to do some more places. The part that I'm really focused on and some other work is on dealing with these distressed real estate. We're trying to do a forum with the New York Fed, and we both have an image of this drain that's clogged with REO properties, with foreclosed properties. In New York State, we have another problem. There are a lot of pre-foreclosure notices out there. They've risen dramatically, and some people believe there's a tsunami coming on foreclosures, even next year and beyond. And I think we need to kind of come to grips with that. Those are the headlines. Thank you very much.
Again, in the interest of time, I'm sorry we don't have time for a lot of questions, but Jim, let me just ask you one question to help set up our panel, which is coming next. Your subhead of your presentation, when we stop the bleeding, now let's cure the patient. Could you just offer a brief summary of how you view the impact of the tax cap going forward?
Yeah, I'm thinking of an analogy. I mean, all kind of analogies are coming up today between the property tax issue and the foreclosure problem, right? Imagine someone's underwater. They owe much more than the house is worth. And you say, okay, we're not going to let you borrow much more. I mean, that's kind of the problem. And I think if you were to measure the present value of the assets and liabilities for local government, many of them are underwater. I think that's what we heard from the mayor this morning. And so allowing continuation of that is like going deeper and deeper in debt. I'd like to see much more accurate measurement of effective property tax rates and begin to think about how those are affecting people. One of the headlines in that presentation has to do with the mobility of the elderly. There is research showing that if the effective property tax rate increases, a lot of older folks move. And I think that's a legitimate concern in parts of New York State.
Thanks very much. I now invite our panel to come up to the front of the room. We are joined by Karen Scharff, the Executive Director of the statewide grassroots organization Citizen Action of New York and the Public Policy and Education Fund of New York. Karen has helped lead successful initiatives on education funding, state tax policy, expansion of healthcare coverage, and voter participation. I think she played a leading role in the successful campaign to pass legislation in 2007 that established a more equitable funding formula and billions of additional dollars for schools. She was also the founder, among the founders, and statewide co-chairs of the Alliance for Quality Education and the Working Families Club. E.J. McMahon, next to Karen, is Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and its Empire Center for New York State Policy. His work includes important studies on public pension reform, collective bargaining, budget trends, and tax policy in New York. He has been a staff writer for the Albany Knickerbocker News and Times-Union, a Vice Chancellor of the State University of New York, Deputy Commissioner of the State Department of Taxation and Finance, among other positions, Research Director of the Public Policy Institute of New York State, where he developed the template for the state's school report cards. Most important for today's discussion, he's, I think it's fair to say, the intellectual godfather of the property tax cap that is now law in New York State. Bob Lowry, next to EJ, has been Deputy Director of the New York State Council of School Superintendents for the past 9.5 years. Previously, he served as the Principal School Aid Analyst for the Assembly Ways and Means Committee, Assistant Secretary to the Governor for Education and the Arts under the first Governor Cuomo, and Manager of School Finance and Policy Development for New York State United Teachers. So Bob has something of a unique perspective in having played various roles that have allowed him to consider education policy and finance from multiple perspectives, executive and legislative, labor and management, and program and budget. So Karen, would you start off this discussion?
Yeah, I need the remote. Thanks. So I feel like kind of shifting now to impact, at least for me, and onto the impact on schools and on students, both of the fiscal crisis generally and of the property tax cap in specific. And I want to kind of start by summing it up, not just in terms of the property tax cap, but our overall situation. You know, last year with the enactment of the tax cap, the second year in a row of drastic cuts in state aid to schools, and also the enactment, which is not as well known as it should have been, of an actual state spending cap on state schooling. New York State really decided at that point, after all these decisions last year, that it's no longer committed to providing the sound basic education required by our state constitution. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that's true. But property taxes and state aid are so interlinked, and the impact of reduced state aid has historically had such a big impact on property taxes. I kind of want to start with the state level before we talk about property taxes. So this, what this graph shows is, so I'll do a pointer here. There we go. So this is just state school aid, not total school spending. This is where we were in 2006. In 2007, we passed a new state foundation aid formula, which looked at the campaign for collective lawsuit, took all the findings of the courts and of the testimony, and developed a foundation aid system that was based on need and that was designed to provide adequate resources so that every child in the state would get a sound basic education. And based on that formula, it was a 4-year phase-in. It was supposed to phase in, had it been phased in fully, we would be at the top of this blue line right now. Instead, we're here. And you can see that where we are right now is basically back where we were in 2006 on state aid before any of the formula was phased in. So we had 2 years of increases, a year of frozen funding, 2 years of cuts, and now we're back where we started before we decided to address the CFE lawsuit. That brings us to this year. Oops, too far. Well, the previous slide, so this year, we've now had 2 years of $2.7 billion worth of cuts, and under the 2012 executive budget that's now being debated and considered right now, there's a proposal to restore that $2.7 billion out of operating aid, $555 million, which basically restores only one of the $5 that's been cut, but it is. And with that, you know, that's a pretty small dent in the cuts that school districts have sustained. Yesterday we had a big lobby that we organized of rural and small city school districts. And these is all upstate districts. Pretty much all of the most of the upstate districts, in the sort of rural small city category, are really facing the worst problems in the state. So this combination of all the factors of state aid, loss of federal stimulus money, and loss of and property tax cap. And the rural and small city school districts, of that $2.7 billion, $1.2 billion has come out of the small cities and rural districts. And the executive budget only restores $160 million to them, less than 1 out of 7 of the dollars that they've lost in the past 2 years. And not only does it have a serious impact on students, but I just want to say as a side note, it has a serious economic impact on our upstate communities. Because in many of these communities, the school is the biggest employer. And the impact on the economy of these lost jobs is quite significant. Yesterday as we were listening to these different students, superintendents, and teachers talk, it's really kind of, even for me who's dealing with this every day and fought so hard for this money and now seeing it go away, it's really kind of shocking to hear what they're facing. You know, in Scharff, they've gone from 123 teachers down to 83, and they plan more layoffs this year. Fonda Fultonville, having made all the cuts they could possibly find to make over the past 2 years, the superintendent finds himself having no choice but to propose eliminating kindergarten for next year. The superintendent from Onondaga Central School District in Otsego County told us that after a loss of $3 million over 3 years, plus the tax cap, they cannot offer, in his words, a sound basic education anymore. They're looking at closing a school, abolishing all non-mandated programs, including all AP courses, all occupational education, kindergarten, and all interscholastic extracurricular programs from their district. City of Hudson has 34 kids in 8th grade social studies classes, and now they're going to do more layoffs. Messina in St. Lawrence County is only able to offer 2 advanced placement courses to their high school students, and the CO district in Allegheny can only afford 1 advanced placement course. One of the superintendents told us that his valedictorian got rejected by SUNY Geneseo last year, and he called to find out why. They said, your course offerings are inadequate to qualify for our school. So that kid valedictorian doesn't matter. You can't go to SUNY Geneseo because your school is not good enough. And the thing that's also kind of shocking to look at, and we deal with districts all across the state, is that this situation is in stark contrast to the suburban schools downstate. So Scarsdale, 15 AP courses, another 6 college and SAT prep courses, 21 art classes, 28 performing art classes, 4 foreign languages, 21 sports teams, intensive college prep process, including guidance counselors, college planning, college testing for 9th to 12th grades. Rod, 22 advanced placement courses, 27 sports teams, high school programs in the performing arts, including drama, vocal, and dance, tutoring, writing mentor program, elementary school classes limited to 20 students, middle school classes limited to 23 students. Jericho on Long Island, their high school offers 26 college or advanced placement courses, including Chinese, business law, and civil engineering, 26 arts and performing arts classes, 10 business classes, 6 foreign languages, and 20 sports teams. And I think if you ask the parents and students in those districts, they would say that money matters. And just want to sort of flag as a note on that, we have New York has a long tradition of having the biggest disparity in the country. Right now, it's one of the biggest, I think, of the workforce between our poor districts and our rich districts in spending. So we've got Jericho, where they spend $31,813 per pupil, compared to Canton in the North Country, where they spend $17,568. And so you hear these things about New York as the biggest spending state in the country. That's kind of a ridiculous statistic when we have that kind of a gap. And it's like saying you put Karen Scharff and Shaquille O'Neal together and our average height is 6 feet. I'm still the shortest person in the room. Really, those kind of averages are really meaningless, and they're not looking at the real reality of what particular upstate districts are facing right now. Now what about the tax cap? When we were talking about the tax cap under the previous governor, a lot of the talk was around Massachusetts, where they have one of what's really considered the most successful school system in the country, and they have a tax cap. But Massachusetts tied the enactment of their tax cap to significant increases in state aid, and this is why I started with state aid. Is these two things are really inextricably linked, because you got to pay for school somehow, and you can't decide not to pay for the state aid and not to pay for local property taxes both at the same time. What Massachusetts said is property taxes is not a good way of funding education. I couldn't agree more. But we're going to fund it with state aid because that gives us that broader base to draw from to generate the revenue necessary. Bob Ward and I were both advisors to the Property Tax Commission under Governor Spitzer, and I remember when that commission had its hearings and its meetings, one of the things that Tom Swazi, as the chair, kept emphasizing to everybody who he was trying to get on board with the tax cap was, if we have a tax cap, it will force the state to pick up a bigger share of education and fund our schools appropriately. Well, that's not what's happening. Instead, we've got this double hit, large state aid cuts combined with the tax cap. And in addition to that, what a lot of people don't realize is the tax cap has very different impact depending on whether you're a poor district or a rich district. So in addition to all the disparity we've been talking about already, I'm doing wrong here. Should I just move to the next slide, or?
Can you just use the?
You want to just do it on the computer?
Yeah,
There's
just
two more
use on the
slides, so.
computer.
What's going to be coming up in a second is a map of the state, and what the map shows in 10 categories is the current property tax levy per pupil.
That's it.
Oh, there we go. So, I know you can't see this close up, but what you can see with the, up on the left what the code is that basically this, and I took this from the Cornell New York Rural Schools program, so I take no credit for the data, but they basically looked at the average levy per pupil in each of these areas of the state. So the lightest color is the least amount of tax dollars per pupil, the darkest, the most amount of tax dollars per pupil. And so when you have a tax cap, you're capping, it's a 2% over increase over your current tax levy. So when your current tax levy is small, that means that your 2% that you can get off of raising it is obviously much smaller. If you have $10,000, you take 2%, it's $200, and if $20,000, it's $400. So it's a huge, that 2% tax cap, and if you translate it to dollars, is hugely different in those districts with the, small tax levies compared to districts with the large tax levies. And there's on there, they actually calculated, if you look at, for each 1,000 students in the wealthiest decile, a district can raise $550,000 a year under the tax cap. For each 1,000 students in the poorest decile, the district can raise $50,000 a year, so less than 1/10 the amount can be raised. Now, I do have to say though that on the one hand, you know, the tax cap hurts these poor districts because with 2%, they can bring so little money that it has almost no impact on their budget. On the other hand, even without the tax cap, the money just isn't there. I mean, quite honestly, these districts where this property tax levies are so small to start with, that these percentage increases are so small. Their levy is small because people can't afford it. There's just no property tax base. They can't raise the money. The property tax is not a system that allows them to actually fund their schools. So I don't actually think that for the poorest districts, the tax cap is the critical thing right now because they couldn't have raised their taxes anyway, and they haven't been because the money is just not there. So, you know, we're running late, so I'm going to just stop there. I just want to say, just to close, that you know, while there are certainly in any district or any, you know, any actually cost savings to be found, with 2 years of pretty drastic cuts, most of these districts, especially the small city and rural districts, have really cut to the bone, and they're now no longer providing an adequate education to their students. And the solution to that is not really so much around property tax issues. It's really, I think, as the Mayor of Rochester was saying, around alternative funding sources for property tax, which really comes back to state aid and how we're going to address the problem of state aid in our state, especially now that we have a spending cap, which doesn't allow any kind of catch up. And I'll stop there.
Apologize for technical difficulties.
Well, first I need to say thank you to Tom and Bob for inviting me. I was thinking last night perhaps they got a taste of what it's like to be a school superintendent, deciding whether to call a snow day. I'm glad they did. Michelle, do you know if I'm on a mic? I think I turned
Yes,
my.
you're on.
Yeah, okay. What I'll do is talk a little bit about what schools have been through over the last, I guess, 8 years, because it does provide the context for what they're facing now. I tell people that I feel part of my role the last few years has been to travel about the state spreading gloom and doom because of the state's fiscal challenges. And more recently I've tried to say, look, there's a little glimmer of hope. We're getting a state aid increase. And I've had school officials push back on that. You know, things are not getting better, and I can explain why. This is perhaps a somewhat intimidating graph, but it shows the history of proposed school budgets, the property tax report cards that districts send into the state education department when they do their budget votes. Taxes are red, spending is blue, and then the gray is state aid. If I did this in lines, you'd see that as state aid went up, the tax levy increases went down up until 2009-10. There we see a break in the pattern, and you know, we had a much lower increase in state aid, but taxes didn't shoot up. In fact, the taxes went down, 1.9% average increase. Really striking to me to contrast the first year and the last 2 years, similar years, cuts in state aid, surging pension costs. First year, 2003-4, districts asked for tax increases averaging 8.2%. Last 2 years, state aid cuts, deeper state aid cuts, again, surging pension costs, health insurance costs, average tax increases about 5 points lower. I think there has been a change in culture. Democracy has worked in that sense. The other thing I'd say, picking up on some of what Mayor Richards talked about, is if we were to look over a long span of time, we see that there were some really higher than historically normal tax increases in the first part of the last decade. In most of those years, part of what was going on was increases in benefit costs, chiefly pensions and health insurance, exceeded changes in state aid. So that meant that all the other costs, salaries, energy costs, some of the benefit costs, whatever, had to be funded out of local tax increases. But again, I think the last 2 years, you know, we've had the average spending increase is 1.4, 1.3%. Our estimate is that's about half of what districts would have needed to cover just their pension and health insurance costs, even if they'd frozen everything else. And so I think there's been a change in how schools have approached budgeting. This graph is taken from a survey we did late in the summer. Picks up on some of what Karen talked about. and also Mayor Richards. We asked superintendents, which is a bigger concern for you? Property tax cap or possible future state aid levels? If all you looked at was the top line, the statewide figures, people seem to be about equally concerned. But if you look at the lower Hudson Valley, Westchester, Rock, and Putnam, the wealthiest part of the state, it's 65 to 5, the tax cap is very concerned. Poorest part of the state, Western New York, about 2 to 1 state aid. That's because of what Karen and Mayor Richards talked about. As I put it, there are places in the state that were capped by circumstances before they were capped by law. They just couldn't raise enough to cover their pension and health insurance costs or to offset their state aid cuts. And this year, for example, the poorest 20% of districts, percentage terms their state aid cuts were less. They raised taxes by about the same amount as the wealthier districts, but they held their spending flat. Not the average 1.3% increase that we saw statewide. And at the same time, they were absorbing the same pension and health insurance costs as other places, so they had to make deeper cuts. What does it look like going forward? The State Education Department did a school finance symposium in September, and they did projections based on long-term historical trends for spending. They said assume school spending will go up 5.3%. They made assumptions about state aid and property taxes. We had a state aid cap as well. And so they said, given those caps, what kind of gap might we see between spending and revenues? They project 2016-17, 28% gap. I think some of that's kind of exaggerated, if not preposterous. We can't do that. We have to close these gaps. But even if you assume a smaller gap, smaller spending increases, it's still 12%, 10% a year going forward. The point I would make, kind of picking up on some of what Mayor Richards talked about, is we have to close those gaps. Schools are very democratic institutions. We have to get our budgets passed. So spending will be controlled, especially if you insist that we hold to those revenue figures. 3/4 of our spending is in personnel. We've tried to cut things before we cut people in the last 3 years. But if we have to save money on people, on personnel, there are 2 ways to do it. Either spend less per employee, reduce pension and health insurance costs, grow, that sort of thing, or have fewer people. And if we have fewer people, that's going to mean poorer services for students. The tax cap, we could make some assumptions given the rules under the tax cap. Last year, 93% of budgets passed. We don't know how the exemptions would have come into play last year, all that. But if you just looked at, the size of the increases, you need 60% to pass an increase above your tax levy limit. The pass rate would have gone down to 72%, and more steeply among high-need small cities and suburbs. But the point I make is, ask a different question, you'll get a different answer. I think we could see a dramatic change in the turnout next year, and it's very volatile from year to year. 2009, we had a real plunge in no votes, low tax increases proposed. Following year, 50% increase in no votes. We also had a big surge in yes votes, almost the highest ever. Next year, with the tax levy vote, maybe we'll get more people thinking, oh, now I finally have a chance to vote on my taxes. I'm going to go out and vote no. So we could see different patterns with school budget vote turnout. I thought Steve Hancox might talk a little bit more about the law and the cap for school districts. It's not a 2% cap for school districts. There's a levy limit. It's basically 2% with exemptions factored in. If you propose an increase above your limit, you've got to get 60% of your voters to approve. If you propose an increase below that, you only need 50%. But if you don't get your levy approved, you're capped at last year's level, 0, no tax increase. So it creates a dynamic that really pushes districts to ask for an increase below their levy limit. And I think given that the rhetoric has been so much around a 2% cap, it really creates pressure for school leaders to propose budgets with tax levy increases below 2%. And we've done some informal information gathering with superintendents. Our sense is right now that somewhere down around 10% of districts are thinking of using the exemptions, which would allow them to propose a levy increase of more than 2% and pass it with 50%. I would expect that number might come up as we get closer to deadline for adopting budget proposals, and they've considered some of the choices that they have to make. I think there's some speculation, well, maybe this will help us get more concessions from unions. So far, we're not seeing a lot of optimism about that. I think there's also concern about, what do parents understand? Parents are the people who might be most inclined to vote for budgets. Most of the superintendents that we talk to think either parents don't understand it, or they don't have a sense of what parents think, but very few think that parents understand that if the budget is rejected, the district will not be able to raise taxes at all. And I think, the reason why we have this pessimism that I see among superintendents is, three things, and Karen has touched on them. 3 years of cuts and freezes in state aid and the difficult choices that those entail, continuing increases for pension and health insurance costs, and loss of the Education Jobs Fund, which in many districts offsets the value of the school aid increase. And then finally, the tax cap being layered in on top of that.
I turned my mic on, and there it is. Okay, as the godfather of the tax cap and Bob Ward's words, or intellectual godfather, I don't know which word is really implied one way or the other. I'll try not to be too sinister, given the mix of views in the crowd. And we'll see if the PowerPoint goes back up. There it is, okay. I obviously will look at things, or as you might be not be surprised to see here from a little bit of a different perspective, although there'll be overlap, because I think some of us are looking at these issues from different perspectives. But why did the tax cap come about? What led to this result? Well, I three things that I think are maybe obvious to many people in this room, but I'd like to create a little context. Our taxes are exceptionally high, property taxes in New York. That can't be pointed out enough. There was a perception, and perceptions are usually grounded at least partly in reality, of untrammeled growth in the property tax. And there, meanwhile, coupled to these two things, there's a very long-term, meaning really long-term, century-long practically, historical need for mandate relief that's being ignored in Albany. So, how do all these things come together? This is quick. You've got handouts with all these numbers, but I would point out the two things I would point out. New York, if you exclude New York City, which of course is unusual in its taxing capacity and its taxing practices, we have the fourth highest property taxes per capita in the country. And it's worth noting New Jersey and Connecticut at the top of that list. When Bob said something before, he didn't mean it this way, but I was reminded of the nursery rhyme, because in your bars you said taxes are red, spending is blue. Taxes are red, spending is blue. We spend a lot on schools, and New Jersey and Connecticut do too. And that's why they're high on that list. Wyoming doesn't count as a state in the way we're talking about. And some of those other states have no income tax or no economy. So that's why we're high. We're high. In fact, we rank very high, well above national average, in state aid to schools and in taxes, property taxes, used to support schools, almost equally high. Quickly, other speakers have talked about the use of the community data from the Census Bureau and the Tax Foundation data that shows the effective rates in different counties, and how we have, New York State has highest median effective rates as a percent of income and as a percent of house value, depending on where you go. This is another telling chart that I don't think gets enough attention. The Minnesota Taxpayers Association does a great study every year or two in which they go out and actually go through this whole practice of actually creating a hypothetical properties and actually applying taxes to them in different states, which is really practically the only good way to compare property taxes as they actually apply. And again, so this is average. These are homesteads, apartments, commercial properties, industrial properties. And you'll note, now this is interesting, and you'd see interesting results for the Southwest too. We're not that high, we're high in every category. We're not in the top 10, in the top half of the top 10 in industrial taxation. But when you get what's classified as industrial, meaning a factory, other states find ways to overtax factories, including places like South Carolina. But residential, commercial, I mean, who wants to buy a luxury condo in Buffalo paying that kind of tax? Honestly. That's the problem. I mean, we're way, orders of magnitude beyond the norm. This is that's the problem that fed this policy response. A different way of looking at school property taxes, going back to 2000, this is the run-up to the enactment of the tax cap. Note how high those levy increases were early in the decade, and as you know, this excludes New York City. Now, again, and to anticipate a point if I was Bob, I'd make, there's variations in school aid in those years. But notice there's hardly a correlation. It's interesting, and I haven't attempted mathematically to establish this. But yeah, there's big high increases in years when there's school aid cuts or flat school aid increases. There's also huge increases in years when there's big school aid increases. I mean, big tax increases. One trend, and this is a theory that I have just from observing these numbers over the years, is that high aid begets higher spending, begets higher taxes. I think one of the factors that led Governor Spitzer, and he's the guy, you really want to talk about the Godfather, if you want to look at somebody to blame, the guy who started the tax cap ball rolling as an official matter was Governor Spitzer. Why? And he said this in Long Island at his first year in office on a swing through Long Island in the summer. He did the largest school aid increase in history, this massive school aid increase with a promise of multi-year more. And after all this, with no enrollment increase, after all that, taxes still went up 4%. And it suddenly hit him. He almost said it this way: well, I give them more money and they still raise taxes. It wasn't just, yes, is there some crude political cynicism behind everything? I suppose so. But that was actually what was noticed and what stuck in his craw, as I understand it, not having talked to him directly. So these are the numbers that led to this. You had an average school aid increase of 4.8 across the decade with wide variation, and you had an average tax levy increase of 5.7. The school part was what fed it. These are the others. You can see them on the paper you have. These are the rates of tax levy increase in counties, cities, towns, and villages. Towns tend to increase the least. They tend to have the least pressure on their spending. In fact, the most pressure tends to be downstate or suburban towns. Here is, of course, and this is schools, it would be similar for cities in particular. What drove those tax increases? Well, no surprise, I don't think anybody knows how things work. It's personnel. Local governments are about personnel. Schools, above all, are about personnel. From 2000 through school year 2009, actually, school districts throughout the state added significantly to their staffs, both in New York City and statewide, almost uniformly, actually more heavily downstate than upstate. In fact, the wealthiest districts hired the most, but all over they hired the most. The districts that already were doing all those things Karen talked about added more people to do them. So this is partly salary increases, and it's partly staff increases. School Boards Association does a survey every year that found that the average contract increase throughout this period was about 5%, including step and base. Now this spidery thing is employer contribution rates to New York State pension funds going back 30 years and projecting out 40 years. And this kind of is a way of understanding the pension problem. I've excluded New York City from this chart, which is like incredibly horrifically scary. And so the red is the cops and firefighters, the dark blue is everybody else in the local governments, and the teachers are the blue. And what you see is you have this really atypical, really unusual period in the 90s, driven by extraordinary increases in stock values at a point when the pension systems were going all in on their equity investments. And boom. Now, the norm, the long-term normal rate, which is a highly theoretical, almost fantasy rate that the pension system comes up with, is about 11 for all of these people. So you'll note it was way above there, then it's way below here, and now it's way above again. So that is the problem in a nutshell. This is our projection of where they're headed because the pension funds don't do multi-year projections. Here's another problem nobody's talked about. I would have asked the mayor of Rochester about it if he hung around. Forget about pensions. All of this is particularly a city problem. Particularly a city problem. They have legacy tails like the big three auto companies. They have growing numbers of retired employees who get either completely free or heavily discounted health insurance for life. These are the per capita burdens. These are 100% unfunded liabilities. That is, they're paid for on a pay-go basis, and they're paying pay-go now for people who retired years ago. So the city of Buffalo, the city of Syracuse, and the city of Albany, I believe Rochester may be in this category or close, are spending more on health insurance for retired employees than they are for active employees. And there's been extraordinary political resistance, places like Albany, for instance, to any attempt to try to claw back some of this on some reasonable basis. That is a real problem. So these are problems, and this is the governor's pension plan. I'll get to this in a second. It's summarized in the paper. You already know about it. But you won't hear me disagree with what the mayor said about the cost pressures on places like Rochester, on the upstate cities in particular, on school districts. There's no real disagreement on where the cost pressures are coming from. And it is not, I'll part company in one respect, it's not demonizing anybody to observe that when you run an operation that's personnel intensive, that's all about people and what they do and how much you pay them and how productive they are, your attempts to restructure your expenses focus on those people. And it doesn't make them evil when they respond to a set of statutory incentives in a certain way. It makes them human. And what we need to do is we need to think in terms of mandate relief. The key mandate relief issues, other than pension reform, just as the outset, is, and we can get into discussing this perhaps if we have some time, there are issues like the tri-borough, like repealing the tri-borough amendment, which for schools in particular is something that makes teacher salaries very sticky and results even in situations where there are announced salary freezes in salary increases across a broad base of 2 to 3% a year. So with that, I'll conclude, and that sets the stage for our discussion.
We have time for 2 questions. I'm going to pose one, and there's a gentleman, he just headed out. So is there someone else who has a question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Fred Vosberg with J.P. Morgan Chase, and question for Bob or Karen or EJ. In light of what you were saying, there's a lot of rural superintendents we speak to, and many of them say within 2 years they're going to be educationally or fiscally insolvent. So what happens when that 2 years comes? You know, is there a control board for schools, or?
Very succinct answers, please.
Yeah, you know, there is no legal mechanism for a school district or a municipality in New York State to declare bankruptcy. What has happened in the past has been, yes, a control board, but I think there's always been kind of a presumption that there was an element of fiscal mismanagement, and with better management, a district would get back on track. What we're looking at now is, you know, that chart I showed, the lines don't come together, and so there really isn't a good answer to your question, and someone better come up with one.
Nothing to add.
Nothing good. Quick question, and then I'm going to ask the extremely patient Jim Rowley to be our final speaker of the day from Onondaga County. Karen, you said, in referring to Massachusetts and their tax cap, you said that they have one of the best school systems in the country. How do we know that? And how do we know what level of expenditure gives us a good school system?
So, it's a very good question.
And I'd like each of the 3 to give us again a far too succinct answer for the importance of the question.
Massachusetts, I'm just basing it on the, Education Week does their ratings, and they're considered a good reputable source to give these kind of ratings. People have lots of different ratings. I think on most of the different kinds of measures, Massachusetts is pretty either top or close to the top. It's, obviously because these things are hard to measure, it's mostly based on test scores, which is, I don't think, an adequate measure, but it does tell you something. I think the question of what does it cost to provide a quality education, one of the fundamental challenges is that it costs more in the communities that have the least money, because the less prepared you are when you come into kindergarten, the more it costs to educate you, and the worse education you have in the beginning of your education, the more it costs to educate you later with all the remedial costs. And the SUNY Chancellor, Nancy Zimper, has been talking about the remedial cost to SUNY and CUNY of the fact that our high school, our K-12 system is not preparing kids for college. So the cost, the more we don't do well at the beginning, the more it costs us in the long run. So as we start to address some of these big cost issues, I also think we need to, it doesn't cost a lot to provide a good pre-K program or a good kindergarten program. We're eliminating those, and it's going to cost us more in the long run.
EJ, do you want to touch on this?
Well, it's a pretty big question to get into in a short time. I just observe my own provocative impulse in answer to this question always has been, when you say, what does it cost to provide a quality education? My answer is, what does it cost to fly across the Atlantic? The answer is, it depends on which airline you take. And it's not just, and that might sound simplistic in terms of, well, some kids cost more to educate than others. At the end of the day, what you spend on in schools is the people who work in the schools and the way their workday is structured and the way their workload is structured. You don't take dollar bills and sort of impress them into the foreheads of children. And I'm not sure that the entire that using, say, Rye or Scarsdale as an example of what it is any more an example of what it costs than what the numbers of the other extreme would be. I don't think there is any single answer to that. I think, in fact, if you look at what indicators we have, which are inadequate in New York State of educational performance in schools of like resources, you will find variations in outcomes that suggest that there is no one single, that the dollar figure alone is not the answer.
Yeah, awfully big question. You know, I think that we are an incredibly diverse state in ways good and bad. You know, Karen mentioned Jericho. We perennially dominate the Intel Science Talent Search. I think we have some fabulous public schools. Maybe we can no longer afford them, or parts of the state where they exist can no longer afford them. But, you know, I agree with EJ, there's no one, you know, simple answer for that. You know, but we have had some truly remarkable public schools. I think the concern is, you know, more about, you know, what do you need to do to ensure every student gets at least an adequate education. We don't need to give every student a Jericho education.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our panel. And again, I want to thank Jim Rowley for his great patience coming from Syracuse. James Rowley was appointed Onondaga County's Chief Fiscal Officer by County Executive Mahoney in September 2008. The county executive chose Mr. Rowley based on his successful leadership in the town of Clay, where he had served as supervisor from 2006 to 2008, and previously as a member of the town board for a decade. His accomplishments as town supervisor include having merged the town police department with the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department, saving town taxpayers $1 million annually. He has also held senior financial positions in the private sector, including CFO and Director of Personnel for Polaris Library Systems. Mr. Rowley, thank you very much for traveling from Syracuse to be with us.
Thank you. The county executive sincerely sends regrets you couldn't be here today. Part of the benefit of me pinch hitting for at the 11th hour is that I had about 5 minutes of comments. And so, you know, while Onondaga County has a good fiscal reputation, relatively speaking, we are prone to the same negative influences in our budget that all counties and cities are prone to. Mandated cost from state pension, mandated cost from the state pension costs, whose recent growth certainly is unsustainable, healthcare costs, and the rules and regulations that we have to follow in managing all parts of our operation that add the cost of providing services. And so to give you a sense of the impact to our budget, these broad categories of issues, it's important to give you a sort of a baseline of where we spend our dollars. And I'll talk about our local dollars. And the local dollars in our budget are the property tax and the sales tax. And that's our local dollar budget. Our gross budget includes that plus state aid and federal aid. And so our mandated programs as a percentage of our local dollars that we spend, which is about $370 million, is about 45% of all the taxes that we collect, sales tax and property tax from people. It's about $174 million. The second biggest category after that is public safety, which is about $115 million. And public safety includes sheriff deputies, our downtown jail, Jamesville Correctional Facility, Hillbrook, which is a detention home for youth, DA, and probation costs as well. Together, those two items count for 78% of the local tax burden that people are putting forth in the County of Onondaga. Beyond that, we have debt service that is about $17 million, or 4.6% of our local dollar budget. Our health department and mental health departments cost about 4.2% of that pie, a little over $15 million. We do spend on parks and highways together. They're about $29 million, or about 7-8%. And that leaves about 5.2% of the budget. After all of that, that accounts for operational pieces of our budget: law, purchasing, real property tax, the clerk, elected officials. So when you talk about our budget and the impact that mandates and these unsustainable pension costs have on it, there's not a lot of areas to turn to. We're certainly supporters of NICEAC's 9 for 90 campaign. This is the program that's trying to address the 9 most onerous mandates that consume 90% of the property tax. The problem in Onondaga County is that our mandates, how we measure them, is 118% of our levy. And again, you know, our mandates include such things as Medicaid. That's the mother of all mandates. It's 60% of our total mandated costs. 28% of all our local dollars are consumed by Medicaid. Safety net, family assistance, foster care, juvenile delinquency, state training, which is the schools for really bad kids, daycare, the administration of our human service programs in DSS, a 700-person operation in and of itself, preschool handicap. We have to pay to support our bus system in Syracuse and Onondaga County, assign counsel, hospitalization for mental patients, and other mandates, $175 million. Our pension costs, again, just to give you a sense of how those have risen to unsustainable levels. In 2008, our bill countywide to New York State for pensions was $15.3 million, roughly 9.1% of our salary. 2012, that number is going to be $39.2 million. To give you a sense of the increases, in 2009, going from 8 to 9, the increase in the local dollar and the dollar cost of our pensions rose 5.3%. In 2010, it was 41%. 2011, it increased another 33%. 2012, it's going to increase another 28%. All of this, again, is impacting how we have to manage our budget. Our fringe rate countywide with pensions, healthcare costs is at a staggering 58% of payroll. The tax cap is, the county executive certainly supports the governor's effort in the tax cap, and we're going to budget to the tax cap. One way I think about the tax cap, though, it's sort of money that you leave on the table if you don't tax to that level. So, going forward with our budget in 2013, I'm certainly going to suggest to the county executive that we tax to the tax cap level, especially in this environment that we find ourselves in. And, there's no silver bullet for our budget problems going forward. 2013 budget, I projected when we submitted our 2012 budget that our gap was going to be about $15 million. Our legislature, as a result of the adopted budget in 2012, saw fit to cut our levy $5 million. So now I have a $20 million gap to deal with in 2013. And there's no silver bullets. We're going to use the same kind of levers. We're going to look at fund balance. We're going to look at continued headcount reductions. Between layoffs and early retirement that the state provided, we've reduced our FTE count by over 500 since 2008. Those trends are going to continue. And while the short-term solutions are going to be painful, the county executives has a long-term plan in mind, and I think it's a very good model. She's talked often about a joint balance sheet, and we have a perfect example of that in the town of Clay, where I was supervisor. We eliminated we eliminated our police department, consolidated with the sheriffs, and we saved about $1 million when we did that. And then my successors, again, given the environment they were in, went ahead and got out of the contract that we had with the sheriff's department, saving another $1.8 million, if you will. It was a $2.5 million police department when I was supervisor. But the county executive has touted it, and this concept of joint balance sheet is, if the town can save $2.5 million and there's increased costs on the county side, and again, once that contract got eliminated, the sheriff's department had to squeeze their costs down somewhat. but we're still out of balance with them by about $500,000 or $600,000. So the way you look at it, the town of Clay eliminated $2.5 million. The county's gonna pick up $500,000 or $600,000. In total, on a joint balance sheet basis, we eliminated almost $200 million in cost and subsequent property tax. She's been pushing that idea, and she's been investing in other areas to try to create the environment where we can squeeze costs out of the county. One thing that we've done is invested $10 million in a new ERP system. And we bought licenses so that the city, the towns, the villages, any other entity that has to do a municipal budget wants to use our software, they can. And again, the idea is to create the environment where we're all sharing similar data, we're all looking at costs together, we're all looking at things from a joint balance sheet perspective, if you will, and trying to squeeze costs out of the community. And again, there may be some displacements where the costs on the county side have to go up, but if we save more out in the community, everyone benefits. So I guess I'll leave it at there. That's sort of our strategy going forward for dealing with the increased costs that everyone faces. Certainly we have the short-term strategy, which are the normal levers that we push, but the county executive, in her wisdom, is really trying to set the stage long-term so that Onondaga County as a community can squeeze costs down in a collaborative way. So thank you.
I'll just start with one question. I don't know if others will have any. Sorry, you thought you were getting at.
No, that's good.
So if I understood you correctly, you really see the county's long-term fiscal solutions coming perhaps in some measure from mandate relief from the state, but really much more in terms of local efficiencies.
Right, and again, there's no silver bullet short term. We're going to, the county executive clearly supports the governor in his efforts for pension reform and the takeover of Medicaid. Those are key, things for us in terms of reducing our costs. But again, we're not going to get, Syracuse, the city, for example, is in big trouble. We're not going to get to a place, where as a community we're thriving unless we start thinking collectively. We start, collaborating. I hate to use the word, but it's another way of sort of forcing consolidation. Maybe I shouldn't use that word. I might get in trouble. I don't know. But we're really trying to set the environment, and that's what we, that's certainly what the county executive and I certainly agree that going forward, that's what's going to, have our community prosper.
Other questions?
I'm John Whiteley from the New York State Property Tax Reform Coalition. And I just want to make a brief comment that really addresses all the speakers and everything that was said today. We lobby, advocate for property taxpayers. That's really all we do. And we look at it just from that perspective. And from that perspective, I think Dr. Follain made what was perhaps the most significant, important comment in the beginning of this presentation when he said that property taxes are paid by individual taxpayers, one at a time. And we talk so much about average burdens, median burdens, burdens by county, burdens by school district and region. The reality is it's the individual that pays the tax. And every school district, every county has people that simply are overwhelmed by property taxes. The tax cap doesn't help them. STAR doesn't help them. The only thing that really would help them is a circuit breaker. You have some of the biggest burdens in the state that are from people in some of these districts, some of these so-called very wealthy districts, some of these individual taxpayers who don't have the capacity to pay more taxes are the most overburdened. 700,000 families in this state making less than $100,000 a year are paying over 10% of their individual income in property tax. This is not sustainable. And so I just wanted to make a plea. I think we forget sometimes that the Swazi Commission, which is supposed to solve all our problems, they recommended 3 things: the cap, a circuit breaker, and mandate relief. We've got the cap. We seem to be getting some momentum on mandate relief, but we seem to have forgotten the circuit breaker. And I know there's a money issue, but that can be dealt with. But people, hundreds of thousands of people out there, we do all this in the name of relieving the property tax burden. Their burden isn't being relieved, so we really need a circuit breaker. And I just wanted to make that.
All right, John, thank you for that contribution. Do you want to know any comment on that?
No, not really.
Okay. All right, please join me in thanking you, Jim. And speaking of the Swazi Commission, Tom Swazi is speaking at Albany Law School, I think on March 27th perhaps, sometime later this month. And also I wanted to mention that in the city of Albany, as some people are aware, this issue of trying to look at the possibility of pilot payments or other payments from nonprofit property owners is the subject of legislation that Councilman Frank Camiso, sitting in the back, pushed through the Albany County Council. The city now has such a commission to investigate these possibilities. I happen to be a member of it along with Frank. And we will be reporting, Frank, sometime in the middle of this year.
That's right. Preliminary report would go out summer, and then around October we would have a final report out. You know, it was now that you mention it, it was interesting too. One of our speakers was talking about how pilots would affect the tax cap or not. And in many cities and across the country, those are not contractual pilots, but they're voluntary agreements that every year those payments are produced to the locality, be it in most cases the municipality.
In most cases, it's to the municipality, but I thought that was interesting because, you know, if the city of Albany reached an agreement with Albany Medical Center to produce a pilot, I don't know that it would necessarily be contractual. It may very well be a payment that year to year is produced for the city. So it was interesting, but yes, there would be a final report coming out this fall.
Well, thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you at the next forum.